Hello everyone, it's Steve Brown from VPS Securities, Head of Institutional Sales Department. Our special guest today is Mr. Michael Kokolari. He's the Chief Economist of one of Vietnam's largest asset managers with a listed London Stock Exchange Vietnam Opportunity Fund and multiple other local domestic funds in Vietnam. Michael Kokolari, as Chief Economist, will be joining us to discuss where he sees the 2025 outlook for Vietnam, where Vietnam's come from over the years, increase in GDP per capita growth, and potential for the economy. Michael, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Thanks.
So, Mr. Kokolari, you're one of the most...
By the way, I feel old when you say that.
Well, you are one of the most experienced economists in Vietnam.
Now I feel even older.
Yes,
sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. And you are renowned as one of the experts in your field. You're Stanford educated, you're Harvard educated, probably uniquely so in Vietnam's securities and capital markets landscape. Firstly, before we deep dive into VinaCap and your role, which is well regarded from pretty well Norway to New Zealand with the investors that you have through your suite.
Now you're getting too flattering.
With
but thank you.
With your suite of funds, you know. And well, I've been here 12 years and I do know that there's a lot of people who invest through VOF and the Cayman feeder funds, and then also increasingly now the domestic funds. What brought you to Vietnam?
Well, before I get to that, regarding the last point you made, we have a fabulous investment team here. I'm really, really have a very high regard for all of our coworkers. Okay, actually, I came here, a little bit of a quirky story. I think a lot of people ended up here and, however they ended up here. I was a derivatives trader. I'd worked in JP Morgan, Paribas, First Boston, Lehman Brothers. And after the Lehman Brothers collapse, I came here basically on a vacation because we had a huge turmoil in the market at that time. Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, and my specialization was these toxic assets, they call CDOs, this kind of stuff. And I was just kind of
collateralized debt obligations.
Collateralized debt obligation, right? Which almost doesn't exist anymore now. And I kind of came here just thinking that this would be a nice place to sort of hang out until the market thing calmed down and the derivatives markets revived. And I found out that I actually really liked living here very much. Initially, I was teaching in the National University in the mathematics department, and I found the students were fabulous, very smart and all that kind of stuff. And, like a lot of things in life, just one thing led to another, and I ended up, now I've been more than 15 years actually here. So it's been a fabulous, I think it's probably one of the most interesting places in the world to live right now. Although we should probably not tell too many people about that. keep it for us, kind of a hidden secret.
You're right, everyone has a unique entry story to Vietnam.
Yeah.
And I found over the years, once you do, as a foreign expert, experience Vietnam, if you're genuinely interested in the people and the culture, you tend to stay a long time. Become almost one with the culture, with the country, and help drive it forward. Actually,
I would say for me personally, on a psychological level, I like the profile of the Vietnamese very much. They're very intelligent, but it's not quite that a little bit sometimes over the top ambition of the Chinese, or the kind of overly kind of passive of the Japanese. So for me, psychologically, I really like my coworkers and my Vietnamese friends very much. So it's kind of fits for me. It's the right place.
With VinaCap, VinaCapital, founded by Don Lam, Andy Ho, and then latterly Brooke Taylor. The staff is an exemplar of hiring foreign experts. So that way you've been very successful with the AUM build. You've been very successful in promoting the Vietnam investment thesis. Brooke Taylor's written a book, as you can see here. Andy Ho, one of the late great co-founders of VinaCap, he also published authored works on investing in Vietnam. And yourself, you're a very prodigious publisher of economic output, fact sheets, US tariff talks is one of your latest productions, and also the drivers of the overall broader Vienna economy. So if we have a look at some of these, we won't dwell obviously too much on US tariff talk, because there's that hiatus period of time decay now, isn't there, with the 90-day period. But Vietnam did get on the leaderboard there with some other countries.
You mean in terms of being one of the first ones to get into negotiations with the US? You mean?
Well, yeah. It's actually, they've actually started, haven't they?
Because you must imagine that the line of countries that are trying to get in to see them is very long.
I would imagine so.
So the fact that Vietnam is one of the first ones kind of reflects, the
importance of the relationship. So, and like people like Scott Bessent and also others, I think they're very proactive and keen to welcome Vietnam over and have a chat to them, because it is seen by a lot of the large US manufacturers as an alternative of choice in Asia for manufacturing. Stability is far more certain as far as the economy goes. You're not having the political ructions and turnover between the police and the military and certain other Southeast Asian nations.
That's right.
And your thoughts, firstly, on where you've seen that, the announcement, the kind of psychological reaction, and then the robust political reaction, and where you've seen the Vietnamese delegation now be welcome to start negotiations.
Okay, that's a really interesting line of questioning. I myself was very surprised that we got targeted.
At that percentage?
I think in the local securities industry, I probably was the one that was the most adamant in saying we wouldn't get targeted. I think the consensus was expecting about 10% tariffs, and I was expecting it would be even lower than that, because of this very important role that Vietnam can play in helping the U.S., sort of achieve its geopolitical objectives in the region, et cetera, et cetera. So I was pretty surprised about that, I have to say. My gut feeling is we're probably going to end up with about 20% tariffs. And at that sort of level...
EU kind of level.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think at that sort of level, that basically will knock about 1 percentage point off of this year's GDP growth.
Which is still very bullish.
Yeah, it would probably be around 6-ish, more high, above 6, which when you think in the world, that's like still a really big number, you know. The thing I am a bit concerned about is when I think about, so first of all, I'm very, the government here is taking it seriously. They're, I mean, basically what they need to do is really ramp up purchases of LNG. In my understanding, from talking to some real experts in the field, Vietnam can probably purchase something like $30–35 billion a year of LNG. And it's a whole long story, but there's these ships that you can sort of degasify, generate the electricity, send the electricity onshore, et cetera, et cetera. So even before we have the LNG receiving terminals built,
you can store them.
Yeah, which would probably take about 4 or 5 years, something like that. Yeah, even before then. Even before then, you can start buying a lot of, and I happen to know someone who was sort of in the room for some of the negotiations, and I think this is on the U.S. side, and I think this is what they're expecting on the U.S.
That would be a fast, efficient, and environmentally effective approach, wouldn't it? Because if they say that they're going to sign a series of MOUs for things like new aircraft and everything else,
the U.S. doesn't want to see MOUs right now. They want to see a checkbook.
A contract.
Here's our first $1 billion of the LNG.
Yes.
So and my sense, I'm not privy to what's going on the Vietnam side. As I say, I happen to coincidentally, we have a kind of quite tight-knit Stanford University alumni network here, so a lot of us know each other. So I do know that on the U.S. side, they want to see, purchases and start now. And I think on the Vietnamese side, Don Lam, our chairman, has got very good connections, and I think they're taking it very seriously. So let's say that they do that, and that puts us back in kind of good graces with Trump, particularly. That will be good in terms of, I think you would see the tariffs probably come back down to about 10% like a year later, because it's not in the U.S. interest to target Vietnam. This doesn't make any sense. But all that having been said, one thing I do think about is that for the long-term FDI outlook. So there's a lot of attractions to put a factory here. The workforce is very, people are very smart. The wages are sort of less than half those in China. But all that having been said, if you're the decision maker in a multinational and you're figuring out where to put a factory, in the past, you didn't really think about any sort of geopolitical type thing. And so now you're going to have to start factoring that into your mind. So I don't think any factories will leave Vietnam, but I do think that the extraordinary amount of FDI that we used to attract in the past will still attract FDI, but it probably won't be at that kind of outsized rate that we did in the past.
Staying on that, you published a very good summary on the primary nations where the US demand stems from. Like Mexico approaching 17-18%,
right.
Then Canada approaching 12-13%, and then somewhat similarly to Canada, Vietnam.
Right.
So over 10% of Vietnam's economy driven by US demand, as you noted. Made in Vietnam, mostly they were a mix of foreign invested enterprises then exporting to the US, isn't it?
Predominantly.
Yes.
Maybe
overwhelmingly.
Overwhelmingly.
So the thesis that you've stated there about it's not really in their own interest. The Nikes of the world would agree.
Yes, that's true. But I would say even more in the electronics. Let's say that a consumer in the U.S. used to pay like $200 or whatever dollars for a sneaker, and now maybe it's going to go up to $250 or something. Of course, they're not going to be happy. But imagine your iPhone goes from like $2,000 to $3,000 or something like that. Then people are going to be really unhappy.
Yes.
So I would say that the electronics manufacturers will probably have a good amount of sway in the U.S. to and that's why you've already seen Trump made this sort of temporary pause on all the electronics, tariffs on all electronics, even from China to the U.S. And I think that will end up being permanent, actually.
Okay. And like you noted there, you think the rollback from 46 announced might come back to 20, and then later on even lower than that. Okay. Now, so we've discussed that area there. When we're looking now at, say, things such as GDP per capita, the Prime Minister and his team are very bullish. They've still this week come out and said 8% GDP growth forecast for 2025 is still acceptable and they think achievable for Vietnam. World Bank, many others, IFC, ADB, they're all 5% plus still, even after some clawdowns after the announcement on April 2nd about the 46% initial tariff. What are your thoughts on GDP target?
Well, it's very good that they're aspirational. That's a good sign. And the way I'm looking at it is the outlook for exports to the U.S. is clearly going to be weaker this year, no matter what. We're having an initial kind of surge in exports to the U.S. In April, our exports to the U.S., both March and April, our exports to the U.S. are up around more than 30% year on year. That will taper off as the year progresses, and that would be a drag on GDP growth. So even before all this tariff stuff, if you just look at the kind of natural ongoing restocking, destocking cycle of the retailers in the US, I'm talking about Walmart, Target, these kind of people, we were already going to have kind of slower exports to the US this year. Now it will be even more because of the tariff stuff. So if the government has these ambitions of getting like very high GDP growth, the two levers that they have at their disposal are the infrastructure spending. So they previously talked about achieving, trying to get like a 40% growth in infrastructure spending this year. That would more than compensate for the loss in the export growth to the U.S. And then of course the other thing that would really get things going is getting the real estate market, because real estate in and of itself is less than 10% of GDP, but the the sentiment that, you know, consumption is like almost 2/3 of GDP. So if they took steps to really get the real estate market going, and that made people, because of the wealth effect, feel more confident to spend, you know, that would be the best way to try to achieve like a very high GDP growth numbers.
Okay.
So.
And, you know, export recovery supports industrial parks. Finicap has a very large real estate division as well. You invest in all of those areas, don't you? As far as the consumer story goes, there's been a surprising disconnect, you know, like the share prices of, you know, Vietnam's consumer growth story in earlier years. It really saw bullish behavior on the leading VN30 large cap consumer sector stocks like Vinamilk hit 186,000 a share in December 2017. Masan punched strongly through 100,000 VND a share. And when I spoke recently to Masan, they noted that their share price is where it was trading a couple of years ago, but it's a quantifiably bigger and more diversified and more stable business now than then. And same with the people at Vinamilk. When I spoke to them, you know, several years ago when the stock was near 186,000 a share. You didn't have anything such as recycling wastewater, solar power panels on all their dairy sheds, and they're a totally different business now. You know, so. I think, you know, given that there's 100 million Vietnamese, the
your question is why?
The consumer sector, the question is why, in your opinion? I mean, should investors be looking at those as, you know, as an entry opportunity for a long-term portfolio at this moment?
Okay, so you're bringing up a really good point, and the problem is, you know, when you get big, it gets harder to grow. You know, and so what often happens in emerging markets in general is you have a few really sophisticated companies that know what they're doing, and they grow like crazy for years and years, and then they hit, you know, when you look at Vinamilk's market share, I mean, this is like, they really don't, it's not that they have a high market share, they're really dominant. And so now what they try to do is to squeeze out more growth, you know, by little things like premiumization, you know, try to sell like fresh milk instead of, you know, the one in the UHT. So you run out of growth options when you get too big. And I think that's what that's about. So actually, to his credit, my late boss, Andy, who I had a huge respect for, really timed it almost exactly perfectly and started getting us out of Vinamilk right as the growth started, you know, kind of flattening out. Just coincidentally, my father happened to work for PepsiCo, you know, and different story, obviously it's not an emerging market, but they played a lot in emerging markets. And they, in the time that he worked there, they also went through something kind of a little bit comparable in that when you're in this like very high growth phase, you typically trade at a very high PE multiple. You know, go put yourself in the mind of the Peter Lynch type, you know, the PEG multiple versus the growth. And then what happens is as your growth starts to flatten out, you kind of grow into your PE ratio. So those type of firms that previously had kind of, you know, high growth but high PE ratio, now they have kind of normal growth and normal PE ratio. And I think that's the only. And then I guess the other thing too is that and this is where like a firm like ours, like a private equity company comes in, because there's a lot of interesting pockets of growth, for example, healthcare, hospitals, this kind of stuff, that are not listed on the stock exchange. That makes your job harder and our job easier as private equity.
Perfect segue to VOF, because the Vienna Capital Vietnam Opportunity Fund, listed on the London Stock Exchange, top 10 holdings includes a couple of unlisted private equity entry opportunities, such as the hospital sector, Tamtree Hospital. You've got in there as a percentage of the NAV in Q1 2025.
Yeah, it's around 20 or something.
You've got a decent size holding. You've also been cognizant of looking at the historic TMT, T-Med sector leaders, FPT, very large, substantial position, market cap of over 8 billion USD, and you've got about 10% of your NAV on that one. That company, alongside CMC Global, they're actually the leading exemplars of going into international markets, aren't they?
Outsourcing.
If the growth kind of gets that saturation domination locally, they can still go into new markets like the USA.
Well, I think they basically are outsourcers now. I mean, really the driver of all their earning, especially Japan for FPT.
For sure. And CMC Global's now looking at entry into Australia.
Right.
Former Australian ambassador is recently announced as one of their advisory heads for that project.
He's an ex Oracle guy. The
Andrew.
The CMC.
CMC Global.
Very good guy. Very smart. So.
Well,
by the way, for these companies, the key is going to be that, and this just get a little geeky sidetrack. I happen to have the master's in computer science. I don't actually have a, full disclosure, I don't actually have a proper economics background. Although I took many PhD level classes, but not normally to do this kind of job. You should have a PhD in economics. But my background is more sort of math and computer science, and I'm very, very encouraged by all the stuff that's going on in AI for a couple of reasons. One is that the firms you mentioned, FPT, CMC, the productivity tools that are coming out. It's a bit geeky, but there's some tools called like Cursor, Windsurf. People that are in that field will know.
Windsurf just got bought for $3 billion US.
$3 billion, yeah. And it's like, well, they pivoted a few times along the way, but basically in their current incarnation, I think they only had that product out for like a year or something. It's just boom, gone like crazy,
Stanford CVs.
Well, no, those are MIT guys, but the key is that for an FPT or CMC, the engineers here, the quality engineers is very good. They have very kind of a good math, sort of sense, and you will see that their productivity will boom go up like crazy. So that's one good thing for Vietnam. And then the other thing is that I'm sure you know that Qualcomm bought, who is a Stanford guy, by the way, the Vin AI. And they're doing like really hardcore research at VinAI up in Hanoi. And I think that's going to be kind of like a Netscape browser moment for the AI industry here. In other words, we think back to 95, it was the Netscape IPO was kind of what threw the doors open. And I think now the international firms are going to realize that there's like a really great pool of AI talent here.
You're exactly right.
Yeah.
If you look at VinAI, I'm on I'm vice chairman of the Vin University College of Business and Management board up in Hanoi.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And we are launching our MBA in June this year, and there is a specialization in AI and innovation.
Right.
So it's exactly how you've noted it. And
plus, you're doing an entrepreneurial contest for high school students. I mean, which is unbelievable. High school students.
Why not?
It shows like how crazy entrepreneurial everyone in Vietnam is.
and a lot of them are wanting to take executive education as well. This is at the high school level. We've just launched this year the executive education platform modules as well. And yes, we're getting interested high school students. So it's a remarkable thing to see.
Sorry, a little bit of a tangent, but it's hard to explain to people that are not based here, don't live here, that when you're immersed in just how everything is here, the vibrancy, the entrepreneurial mindset, everyone's trying to start a business, everyone's got an angle. I mean, one of the biggest problems that firms like us, Vina Capital, have is when we get these really well-educated, smart people, it's not that we have to worry about our competitors are going to hire them. They all after a couple of years, we train them up and they're like, okay, I'm going to go start my own, whatever. I bumped into a guy in the street yesterday. I was like, what are you doing now? Used to be my intern. Oh, I started a business, something, It's a very common story here,
Yeah. So. And a lot of the private equity firms here, they're having get-together summits. There was a big one we met recently up in Hanoi. And they get global engagement opportunities with private equity, venture capital firms from Korea, everywhere coming here, don't they? So it's certainly a vibrant time. Looking at another sector that Vinacap's very strong in, real estate. Hanoi seems to be firing on all cylinders. A lot of upward momentum's been seen in the large cap listed real estate space up there, Vin Homes, Vin Group, even VRE a little bit as well. the Ho Chi Minh City scene, a little bit of a laggard compared to that, but recovering, you know. What are your thoughts on the broader landscape for the real estate out there?
Yeah, a few things. First of all, as per your specific good point that you're making, I think there's been a lot more focus on the infrastructure development in there the last couple of years. So that's kind of explains a little bit the lag here. But if we step back and look in general, it's a very interesting situation here in that the real estate market, the demand for new housing units is probably double the annual supply. And we calculate the demand by looking at sort of household formation, number of people getting married, blah, blah, blah. And of course, supply, you know the numbers, it's easy to see.
That was Mr. Michael Kokalari, the Chief Economist of Vinner Capital. And we had the distinct pleasure to speak to Michael today at an opportune time, where we've got the impacts of some global macroeconomic issues looking into the Vietnamese equities landscape. Michael's got over 20 years experience, and the Vinner Capital funds include the marquee London Stock Exchange listed Vietnam Opportunity Fund and several local client-facing funds for domestic retail investors. Have a good day.